This is a big celebration day in the life of the Christian church. You know, there are three big celebrations during the course of the year. This is a big one. Next week, of course, is a big one. Pentecost tends to be a big celebration. But I think this one is different in just a little bit of a way. The kind of celebrating we do around Christmas time, for example, seems more kind of grounded and centered and a little bit quieter. The celebration around Pentecost really is about the Spirit being present. It's about the community being filled with the Spirit. And next week, when we're celebrating Easter and the resurrection, it's a lot about, again, that kind of fulfillment of the inner spiritual life and that great cycle of life and death and rebirth. But I think Palm Sunday has a bit more politics to it than some of these other Sundays. Now, at this point, we've made a pretty big deal of this parade, this procession that happened as Jesus was entering in Jerusalem on his way to celebrate Passover. And this would have been a time when a lot of people would have been coming into the city to celebrate this holiday. And we don't really know, like, were there a few people? Were there a lot of people? In my imagination, I imagined huge crowds and the people cheering and that you could hear it from miles off. But that may just be the way that we've made things grander, which is sometimes our way. We do know that this was an improvised procession, an improvised parade. They had to go off to find the donkey for Jesus to ride in on. No one before had made the signs or whatever to hold along the way. Instead, people had to chop down the branches from the palm trees or the rushes that were growing in the field. We don't quite know what they were waving. They threw their cloaks down in the path that Jesus was going to come in on. And it was just a donkey, a very humble donkey. And so we know that Jesus' advanced people, despite their good work in finding that donkey and doing it so carefully and thoughtfully, as was demonstrated this morning, we do know that there wasn't a whole lot of planning that went into this. And yet, you get the sense that this was a moment. That this was a moment, and there were a group of people, and I hope it was a big group of people, who recognized that it was a moment. And they wanted to be there, and they wanted to take part in that. And it was their way of saying, this is the sort of leader we can follow. This is the sort of person that we can believe in. This is the sort of person that speaks to us. And these folks probably would have been some of the poor and the dispossessed in the land. People who had heard Jesus' message about healing and love. So I just hope that there were a whole lot of people. But they would have had to kind of figure that out on the fly, or they would have missed the whole thing. And then what would we have done on this particular Sunday of the church year? But it did happen, and there was a certain amount of glory to it. And I just hope that when the parades are going to happen, we recognize it. When the parades are going to happen, I hope that we can recognize that, and I hope that we can be there to add our voice, to add our energy, to add our big yes to whatever is going on. Now, I have a feeling that many of us, if not most of us in the crowd today, have had some moment where you've recognized that there was a parade or a procession or a march or a demonstration or something or other where you realized, I have to be there. Anyone had that experience? Yeah, so hopefully we would recognize when the parade was happening that we could bring our bodies together to give that energy and to give that voice. And that's such an important part, I think, of how things shift and how things change. We can be at home on our own, believing one thing or another all by ourselves. We might get little hints from reading the newspaper or something online that suggests that someone else agrees with us. But there's something about when we all gather together and say the same thing. It's a completely different experience. I would hope that we would recognize when the parade was going to happen. I feel like that's happened for me a few times in my life. When I went off to college in 1971, This would have been during the time when there was a lot of Vietnam protests. But not much. I hadn't been involved much in Indiana when I lived there, but I moved to go to school in St. Paul. And I can remember at least a couple of times when there were big marches around the Vietnam War, and this was also an election year, and Gene McCarthy came through, and Shirley Chisholm came through. She was running for president. And these were times when we could come and add our voices and add our bodies to these movements. There was a time in the 99% stuff when the Occupy Wall Street and Occupy Oakland were having, where there was a call for a march. The primary purpose was to shut down the port of Oakland because there were political things happening there. But it was at that time where people were starting to gather around these issues of income inequality. And I can remember being part of that march, going downtown Oakland, not far from where I live, and seeing this great crowd of people gathering without too much preparation beforehand, without too much prior knowledge. And yet there were thousands of us. And as we got closer to the port, there's a point where the road goes up over kind of a bridge. And when that happened, you could look back and see this huge, long line of people. Huge, long line. And I can remember feeling that sense of hope and possibility. What might happen? What might change with this many people coming together? Now, sometimes the results of the parades, the results of the protests, the results of the marches, even this procession into Jerusalem, the results of that are not always so clear. Did the people who participated in that procession, that Palm Sunday procession, the very first one, carry with them a sense of hope and possibility? Or did it kind of seem to dissipate as the crowds did? So not only do we need to recognize when the parade is coming by so that we can come and add our bodies and voices to it, so that we can become one larger body around an issue or an idea or a hope or a dream. But we also have to be able to sustain that when the parade ends. And perhaps that's the purpose of those kinds of events, those big events that fuel us, that give us energy, that we can remember. We've just witnessed the reenactment 50 years ago of the March Across the Bridge in Selma. And that march was so powerful in its time. And it's been held as a powerful moment in the civil rights movement. And then to reenact it, to participate in it again, whether we were right there or whether we were watching it on television or some other media, we get to revisit that. We get to have that again and to remember, to be reminded, to have our passions reignited, our sense of commitment and hope and possibility. So I invite you today to join the parade, to be a part of this day of celebration where we can say, yes, this is the person that we're choosing to follow. This is the person who speaks the gospel of love and possibility. This is the person who we are going to treat as our leader, even our king. Don't miss the parade, and don't forget the parade. Amen.